Colorado today, the mystery of the little girl found strangled in the basement of her house. It's been more than a week since the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, a 6-year-old beauty queen, shocked the town of Boulder. So far, there are no arrests, but many troubling questions.
December 26, 1996, the day after Christmas. In Boulder, Colorado, a family woke up expecting to continue their holiday celebrations. Instead, they found a handwritten ransom note. Their 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét Ramsey, was gone. The note demanded $118,000 for her safe return and warned the family not to contact police. At first, investigators believed they were dealing with a kidnapping, but as the day unfolded, that assumption would quickly change. Within hours, JonBenét's body would be discovered inside the very house she was believed to have been taken from. What followed was one of the most debated criminal investigations in American history, a case filled with unanswered questions, conflicting evidence, and competing theories that continued to divide investigators nearly 3 decades later. Despite years of investigation, one question remains unanswered. What happened to JonBenét Ramsey? To understand why this case remains unsolved, we need to begin with the morning it all started. December 26, 1996, the day after Christmas. For the Ramsey family, the morning began like any other. They were preparing for a trip. According to later accounts, the family planned to fly to Michigan that day before continuing on a vacation. But before those plans could begin, something unusual caught Patsy Ramsey's attention. As she walked downstairs, she noticed several pages lying on one of the staircases inside the house. At first, it looked like an ordinary note. Then she started reading. The message claimed that her daughter had been kidnapped. It demanded $118,000 for JonBenét's safe return. It also contained a warning. Do not contact the police. Patsy immediately went to JonBenét's bedroom. Her daughter wasn't there. Moments later, she called 911. The call was placed at approximately 5:52 in the morning. Within minutes, officers from the Boulder Police Department arrived at the Ramsey home. At that point, investigators believed they were dealing with a kidnapping. A child was missing. A ransom note had been left behind, and time was critical. As officers searched the home, they waited for further instructions from the people who had supposedly taken JonBenét. Friends and family members also began arriving at the house to offer support. Then the waiting began. An hour passed, then another, but the phone call described in the ransom note never came. The longer investigators waited, the more unusual the situation became. What no one inside the house realized that morning was that the case they were treating as a kidnapping was something very different. And before the day was over, a discovery inside the Ramsey home would change the investigation completely. By early afternoon, investigators were still waiting for answers. The phone call described in the ransom note never came. Hours had passed, yet there was still no sign of JonBenét. Detectives continued searching the house. Then, shortly after midday, they made a simple request: search the home again. One of the people asked to do so was John Ramsey. Along with a family friend, he began moving through the house room by room. Eventually, the search led them to the basement. The basement contained several storage rooms. As John moved through the area, he approached a small room near the far end of the basement. He opened the door and immediately saw his daughter. JonBenét Ramsey had been inside the house the entire time. The kidnapping investigation was over. They were no longer searching for a missing child. They were investigating a murder. In a state of shock, John picked up his daughter and carried her upstairs. Investigators would later determine that this may have disturbed important evidence. But at that moment, preserving a crime scene was the last thing on anyone's mind. For the people inside the house, everything had changed. The questions facing investigators had changed as well. How had JonBenét died? Who was responsible? And had the answer been inside the house from the very beginning? Before looking at the evidence, it's worth taking a moment to understand who JonBenét Ramsey was. JonBenét was 6 years old. She lived in Boulder, Colorado, with her parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, and her older brother, Burke. By most accounts, she was an energetic and outgoing child. Friends and family described her as confident, social, and full of personality. She attended school, spent time with friends, and enjoyed many of the same activities as other children her age. JonBenét was also involved in child beauty pageants. She participated in local and regional competitions, often performing on stage in front of large audiences. Years later, those pageant photographs would become some of the most recognizable images associated with the case. For many people who followed the investigation, those photographs became their first impression of JonBenét. They appeared on television broadcasts, newspaper front pages, and magazine covers across the country. But they represented only one part of her life. To the public, she became the face of one of America's most famous unsolved cases. To the people who knew her, she was a 6-year-old girl with a family, friends, and a future that was suddenly taken away. As investigators began examining the evidence inside the Ramsey home, they were faced with a growing number of questions, and the answers would prove far more difficult to find than anyone expected. To understand the investigation, detectives first needed to understand the family's final known movements before JonBenét disappeared. The events of December 25, 1996 began much like they did for countless other families. It was Christmas Day. The Ramseys spent the morning at home, opening presents and celebrating together. Later that day, they attended a holiday gathering at the home of family friends. Photographs taken that evening show what appeared to be a normal Christmas celebration. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. After spending several hours with friends, the family left the party and returned home later that night. According to the Ramseys, JonBenét had fallen asleep during the drive home. John Ramsey later said he carried her inside and took her upstairs. From that point on, the timeline becomes far less clear. The family would later provide accounts of what happened after they arrived home. But investigators spent years examining those statements, comparing them against physical evidence, and attempting to reconstruct exactly what occurred inside the house that night. At some point between the family's return home and the discovery of the ransom note the following morning, something happened inside the Ramsey residence. Exactly what happened remains one of the central questions of the case. And as detectives began looking more closely at the evidence, they quickly encountered details that didn't fit neatly together. As detectives began looking more closely at the evidence, one item immediately stood out: the ransom note. At first glance, the note appeared to support the idea that JonBenét had been kidnapped. But the more investigators examined it, the more unusual it seemed. For one thing, it was unusually long. Most ransom notes are brief. This one stretched across multiple pages and contained detailed instructions, warnings, and demands. Investigators also learned that the note had not been brought into the house. According to the evidence, it appeared to have been written inside the Ramsey home itself. The paper came from a notepad belonging to Patsy Ramsey. The pen used to write it also appeared to come from inside the house. To detectives, that raised an important question. Why would someone enter a home, remain there long enough to write a lengthy ransom note, and then leave it behind? Another detail drew attention as well. The note demanded $118,000. The amount was unusual because it closely matched a recent bonus John Ramsey had received from his employer. It wasn't a round number. It wasn't a random demand. It was a very specific figure. Over the years, handwriting experts examined the note in an effort to determine who may have written it. Their conclusions varied. Some experts believed certain individuals could be excluded. Others were less certain. No examination was able to produce a definitive answer. The ransom note would become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. Not because it provided answers, but because it raised so many questions. And the deeper investigators looked into those questions, the more complicated the case became. As investigators continued examining the Ramsey home, they began piecing together the physical evidence left behind. But instead of providing clear answers, much of that evidence only deepened the mystery. One of the most significant discoveries involved DNA. Over the years, biological material recovered from JonBenét's clothing became the subject of extensive testing and debate. Some investigators believed the findings pointed toward the possibility of an unknown individual. Others argued that the evidence was too limited to draw definitive conclusions. The result was yet another question that remained unresolved. Investigators also examined the condition of the basement where JonBenet was found. The room itself offered few obvious answers. There were no clear signs of a forced entry directly connected to the location. No single piece of physical evidence was able to explain exactly what had occurred. Attention also turned to various items recovered from inside the home. Among them were objects that investigators believed could potentially be connected to the events of that night. Forensic experts analyzed fibers, fingerprints, handwriting samples, and numerous other pieces of evidence collected throughout the house. Yet, despite years of examination, no single finding was able to establish a complete and uncontested sequence of events. And that may be one of the most unusual aspects of the entire case. In many investigations, evidence gradually narrows the list of possibilities. In this case, the evidence often seemed to do the opposite. Nearly every major piece of evidence became the subject of competing interpretations. What one investigator considered significant, another might view differently. As the years passed, the case became less about a lack of evidence and more about how that evidence should be understood. And that disagreement would eventually contribute to one of the biggest debates surrounding the investigation. Who, if anyone, should be considered a suspect? Over the years, investigators, journalists, and members of the public have proposed countless explanations for what happened inside the Ramsey home. But most theories can be placed into two broad categories. The first is the intruder theory. The second is the family involvement theory. Supporters of the intruder theory argue that someone outside the Ramsey family entered the home that night and was responsible for JonBenét's death. Those who support this theory often point to the unidentified DNA that was recovered and the possibility that someone may have entered or exited the house without being immediately detected. For them, the ransom note, unusual as it was, may have been part of an attempt to mislead investigators or conceal what had occurred. However, the intruder theory also faces challenges. Investigators found no clear consensus regarding how an intruder would have entered the home, remained inside long enough to write a lengthy ransom note, and carried out the crime without leaving behind more definitive evidence. As a result, questions surrounding the theory remain. The second major explanation is the family involvement theory. This theory proposes that someone within the home may have been involved in the events that occurred that night. Supporters of this theory often focus on the ransom note itself, along with other details that they believe are difficult to reconcile with an outside intruder. Over the years, various versions of the theory have been proposed. Some focused on individual family members. Others suggested a combination of circumstances that investigators may never have fully understood. Yet this theory also faces significant challenges. Despite decades of investigation, no family member was ever convicted in connection with the case, and many aspects of the evidence remain disputed. In the years that followed, both theories gained supporters. Both theories gained critics, and both theories struggled to explain every piece of evidence. That may be the most frustrating aspect of the case. No matter which explanation is proposed, unanswered questions remain. Evidence that appears to support one theory often creates difficulties for another, and evidence that weakens one theory does not necessarily prove the other. Nearly 3 decades later, the debate continues, not because there are no theories, but because none of them have been able to provide an answer that satisfies every question raised by the evidence. Nearly 3 decades have passed since the events of December 26, 1996. Over those years, investigators examined thousands of pages of reports, analyzed forensic evidence, conducted interviews, and explored countless leads. Yet, despite all of that work, one question remains unanswered. What happened to JonBenét Ramsey? The case has generated debate for decades. Investigators, journalists, experts, and members of the public have all examined the same evidence and often reached different conclusions. Some believe the answer lies outside the Ramsey home. Others believe it lies within it. But no explanation has been able to account for every question raised by the evidence. Today, the case remains officially unsolved. And while theories continue to be discussed, the central mystery remains unchanged. A 6-year-old girl lost her life, and the circumstances surrounding her death have never been fully explained. Perhaps that is why the case continues to capture public attention nearly 30 years later. Not because of a single piece of evidence, not because of a single theory, but because, despite everything that has been uncovered, the most important question still has no definitive answer. What happened to JonBenét Ramsey,